Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Hello, and welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth with me, your host, Peter Robbins, and now being broadcast on KUNX Digital Broadcasting. This is kind of an exciting show for me in that it is our first show for September. The summer will soon be gone and just a memory. But several days ago, on the first of the month, a new book on an extremely important case was published. And we're lucky enough to have one of the authors with us tonight. It's a UFO incident that many of you are familiar with, but there has been so much additional research and investigation into it, especially surrounding the experience of the living individual of the two who were caught up in this life-changing event. And I have with us tonight Dr. Irena McCammon Scott. She is an American author and physiologist. Irena received her bachelor's in science from Ohio State University and master's in science from the University of Nevada, also receiving a PhD from the University of Missouri in the Department of Veterinary Medicine. Her postdoctoral studies were done at Cornell University, several miles from where I am. Irena has been employed as an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at St. Bonaventure University and has done research and teaching at the Ohio State University, the University of Missouri, the University of Nevada, and at Battelle Memorial Institute. She worked in related fields for many years, studying many species, including bonobos and their behavior. She was a correspondent for Popular Mechanics magazine and has also worked as a volunteer astronomer at the Ohio State University Radio Observatory, as well as participating in UFO investigations for Defense Intelligence Agency and the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. Dr. Scott is the author of 6 books, 7 now, including on UFOs, also journals, articles, magazines, and newspapers. Her listings include Who's Who in the World, Who's Who in the World, Who's Who of Women, Who's Who in the Midwest, the Dictionary of International Biology, and Who's Who in Frontier Science and Technology. Her 2008 book, Uncle, My Journey with John Prudine, is a biography of John Purdue, founder of Purdue University and the Purdue Block in Lafayette, Indiana. The foreword is by William Allen, author of Starkweather, Inside the Mind of a Teenage Killer. Arias, The Life of a Texas Coastal County. The book is the first of the Founders series published by the Purdue University Press. Her latest book, authored with Philip Mantell, is titled Beyond Reasonable Doubt, The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. And Dr. Irena Scott, it is a pleasure to have you back on Meanwhile Here on Earth.
It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, you're so welcome, and thank you for bearing with me while I stumbled over a number of fairly easy to pronounce words. Irena, it has been some time since we saw each other, and because it's been a main theme of this show from the get-go, before we move into the actual case and the book, I wonder if we could begin at the beginning. where were you born? And can you tell us a little bit about your family?
I was born almost right here, next door neighbor on the next door neighboring farm that's been in the family since about 1803. And I left after high school for a number of years and came back to the farm, and I'm here again.
The farm is located where?
The farm is located in Ohio, north of Columbus.
And you've shown, well, I've seen pictures of it, and it's a beautiful farm, wonderfully traditional, with a beautiful home and a barn that just radiates character. You grew up very much in the natural world, surrounded by animals and nature, as well as going to school, like all kids. Can you give us an idea of what your life was like as a child? What dreams did you have? How did you spend your time? And I'm talking fairly early childhood here, 4 to 8 years old, say.
Okay, 3 years old, I can remember some things. And we used to farm with horses. We had a team of horses instead of a tractor. We were so primitive. We had outside plumbing, and we were like like cavemen or something. I don't know.
Wow.
But it was sort of a struggle sometimes.
Yeah.
And I can, what I remember most is the horses, and then some other things starting at age 3, such as hitting my head and having a big scar. And I know that's true because it was in a picture.
Yeah.
And so at first, when I was a very young kid, I was just around the farm, and I kind of stayed out in the woods a lot. We were sheep farmers. And then I started into school. And back then, you didn't really learn writing until you were in school. So I was about 6 years old before I learned reading and writing. They didn't have kindergarten or anything there, and we didn't have media in the house. Yeah. My father didn't like books, and so we didn't have very many books, if any. And so that's when I started reading. But I think one of the first things I was aware of that I wanted to be an astronomer. And I, all through grade school, I said, I want to be an astronomer, and everybody said, you can't do that. And then I went to college and signed up, majoring in astronomy. And then I started looking for jobs. And then I found out, that they didn't hire women, and nobody gave me an application. So I changed to biology and majored in that. But even after that, I wanted to get into astronomy. And so I had a degree in biology, but I had also had astronomy and physics and math and everything.
Yeah. And
so I started working for the government in mapping. And I think the name of the place now is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which was using satellite photography. But I didn't get to map other planets. And so I switched again. I wound up in the Defense Intelligence Agency in satellite photography. And I was a professional photo interpreter, photogrammetist. And then I wasn't getting any closer to astronomy. And I got married and moved to Nevada, where my husband lived. He had worked at the test site, and he'd actually worked in Area 51, which I didn't know anything about then. He told me, and I didn't know anything about it back then. And so I started working for the university under an ecologist, and traveled up and down mountains in a 4-wheel drive that was always falling apart and nearly got killed and nearly went over cliffs and everything else.
Jeez.
And then I was accepted with a fellowship to get a PhD at the University of Missouri College of Veterinary Medicine. And I was very, very happy with that. And then I had a postdoc at Cornell and became a professor at St. Bonaventure University. And my husband had moved to New York then too, but he lost his job. And so he started looking for jobs, and he got a real good one back here in Columbus near the farm. And so he was a director of data processing for Tioga County, New York, and then he came to Ohio and became a systems analyst for Columbia Gas. And I started working for the university and had about 3 or 4 jobs, working for Popular Mechanics in the university in Battelle. And then I wound up at the Ohio Department of Health as a toxicologist.
Irena, in a way, yours is such a innately American success story. The fact that as a woman, as a girl, you were told you couldn't do something because that's not something girls who grew up into women did, except that you persevered. And, if one looks at your academic credentials only, a more distinguished, how can I say, an unassailable real world group of credentials. There's nothing flighty about them or mystical or weird. At the same time, an entire part of your life has been spent having experiences that, for folks that are unfamiliar with them, would possibly categorize you as a complete outsider, of dubious mental stability. Again, times are changing. And as you know as well as I, the last few years have been there is a fly in this room who has just signed his own death warrant after the show if he doesn't leave. Anyway, when do you first remember having a non-standard experience of this type, either involving other intelligences or what we've come to call truly anomalous UFOs?
One of the first ones was, I had another witness too. It was my sister and I, and at that time we had never heard of UFOs. So,
how old were you?
I think I was around 6, and I think she was around 4, but I can't say for sure.
Sure.
But it was years before we ever heard of UFOs, so there was a stigma about talking about UFOs, but we didn't know it was a UFO. And so we told everybody about it, and a lot of the family still remembers, or did. It was a summer night, and we had gone to bed, and I'd gone to sleep, and I suppose she had too. And we were in a bedroom on either side of just a room. And I can say there was no storm going on, and I have reasons for that. But it was a nice, clear night. And I woke up, and there was this thing flying around the room. And it was a little thing. It looked like a Tic Tac today, except it looked like a literal real Tic Tac. It was about the same size and shape. But at that time, I think I called it like a cough drop. And it was flying around the room. It was sort of the color of hot iron, like molten iron. And it glowed. And I had no idea what it was. But I noticed that the room was dark, but it seemed to know where things were. And it came close to both of us several times. But if it would go toward a wall, it would turn before it got to the wall, and it would go around furniture and stuff. And it didn't blink or anything, like a lightning bug. It didn't look anything like a lightning bug to start with. And so even at that young age, I knew it was pretty weird because it was dark and it knew where things were. And it would fly toward a wall and turn and go around, but it came close to us several times. And it was just kind of just browsing around the room. And then it went to the room had one window, which was screened, and a door was closed on the other side.
Yeah.
And it was an attic room, and the walls came up to the ceiling, and there was about 3 feet in the ceiling, space between them. And there was a chandelier in the middle of the room that was turned off. It flew up toward this ceiling and turned and went across the ceiling to where the chandelier was. Then it began to circle the chandelier, and it didn't feel its way around or anything. It just circled the chandelier like it knew where it was, and it knew where the walls were, and it just circled between the chandelier and the walls. Circled and circled and circled and circled and circled. And then it came down in an exact spiral, like if you drew a line right straight down through the chandelier. And when it got to about a point where it was just about directly below the chandelier, it kind of disappeared or exploded or something. I'm not too sure. But anyway, at that time, we weren't talking to each other about it. And I didn't know she was awake. And she apparently knew I was awake. But we didn't have any idea how it got in the room. And we woke up about the same time, apparently. And at that time, when it disappeared, we both just became absolutely terrified. We weren't terrified before. And ran out of the room and ran in such terror that we bumped into each other down the stairs. And then we couldn't get the door open to the bottom of the stairs. And finally we did, scrambling. We just went shrieking to our parents. And they didn't believe us. So that's the first thing that happened.
Bad dream as far as they were concerned?
Well, they couldn't say that because, I mean, if it had been one of us, they would say it, but there were 2 of us and we weren't even talking to each other when it happened. So we both saw the same thing. So it definitely happened.
When was the next time that you had an experience that was out of the norm?
My sister and I had a big one together, but the next time, I don't remember how old I was. It was in the summer, and we didn't have air conditioning. It was a farm, and we were kind of poor. And I was outside sleeping on a rock. We had a big flat porch rock, and I was sleeping on it. And this, we called it an orb, I guess, came from the north, and it was like, it was orange, and it was like glowing and everything. Airplanes went over that same direction, kind of. But you know, they had airplane lights and wings and airplane sounds and the whole thing. Well, this was just an orange ball, and it looked like it was about the size of an airplane. And it started going over, and then when it was just about exactly over me, I heard dogs all over the neighborhood begin to bark, and our own dog, which was locked in the kitchen where it couldn't see anything, just started jumping around, making all kinds of commotion. And then it went on by. But I didn't tell anybody about that for many, many years, because by that time I'd heard of UFOs, and I knew if I said anything about it, that everybody'd say, "Oh, you're lying." So I didn't say anything about it. I don't know what year it was, though.
Irena, as things progressed in your life, you continued to receive more accolades, degrees, training, more and more a member of the scientific community. Did you struggle at all with trying to reconcile experiences like this with the nuts and bolts reality of the subjects that you are now credentialed or studying to be credentialed about?
Well, they always say that scientists don't believe in UFOs or scientists don't see UFOs or stuff. But I had experienced a lot of prejudice from scientists against me as a female. And so I didn't think scientists were real logical anyway. But I didn't exactly come out of the closet and say I saw UFOs or anything like that for a long time.
How did you first become involved in what I expect was a fairly busy academic family life to investigate your first actual UFO event or sighting? And was it your own or someone else's?
The first, I think, was what wound up resulting in this book. I was in the closet, like I said, the UFO closet. And,
Sure.
you know, if you're in science, especially if you're a female, you don't go around saying, I see UFOs and all that. And so I didn't. But anyway, I got involved in what wound up to be this Pascagoula thing very early, and that was because I was at the University of Missouri. I didn't have a telephone. Or no, I did have a telephone. My mother called one night, and she said, "Did you hear that noise?" And I thought she had just gone crazy because she was in Ohio and I was in Missouri, about 600 miles. And so I told her, you're going crazy, go to the asylum and stuff, in a joking way. She had always said if we thought she was losing her mind, we should tell her. And so I told her. But anyway.
My mom had the same dark sense of humor.
Well, I was joking with her, but, I had to harass her a little bit too. And so several days later, she called and she said there was this huge UFO wave, and she was a skeptic. And she said that a UFO had chased one of her friends in a car, and that everybody was seeing, and people were keeping their kids in at night, and people didn't go out at night, and it was just like a war zone. Yeah. And I was in Missouri, and I don't think anything like that was happening, but I thought this was pretty weird for my mother to say things like that. And I didn't do anything about it until many years later. I was at Ohio State University walking through the library, and they had a newsroom. And with real newspapers, tons of newspapers, it was like a vault in the Raiders of the Lost Ark or something. It was just huge. And I thought, well, I'm going to look at that, see if I can find the date on when that happened, that sound. And I didn't expect to. I walked in there and there were zillions of papers, and I didn't even remember the date. And I just guessed it was the middle of October in 73, and that was a wild guess. Yeah. And so I went to there, and I pulled out about one or two papers, and I actually found a write-up on it. So I had a date. And then I discovered that it was heard all over a huge portion of the United States, and nobody could explain it. And so for some reason, I just got interested in that. And I did some research, and I couldn't find, it was way bigger than a sonic boom from an airplane. So I don't know what it was, but I submitted that to a scientific journal, and the state seismologist of Ohio got in contact with me and helped me look for seismograph records and things. And I published, I think it was about 1987, and I wasn't into UFOs or anything then. But it turned out that was a sound that happened the same time as the Pascagoula abduction, which I became involved in later. So it was just very weird how all that happened.
Absolutely. Do you remember the first time that you saw a fully articulated, obviously real, not ethereal, gossamery, but a UFO, the type of which we would say, I can't give this any kind of meaning other than it seems to be a machine and it's metal, and I've never seen anything like it in my life?
Well, I don't know if I ever thought that, but my sister and I had a real close encounter, and a UFO adventure that lasted for for 3 days for me.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Later I had moved and I was working for the DIA, which I was actually in order of battle, and I was supposed to identify aircraft from satellite photography. And I had one of those real high SCI clearances and all that. I mean, the highest, above top secret and everything. And so my sister was at Drew University taking postgraduate work, and we were both on the East Coast, and we wanted to see the New England states. And so I left from the DIA one morning with 2 coworkers and drove up to her dorm and took some pictures of them. And then we were heading on up to Boston. We were going to stay all night at Boston. And then we were going to go up and see the rest of the New England states. Well, I left the 2 men out, and we drove up from New York to Boston. We got there early, and it was still light and everything. It was before cell phones. And so I decided I'll look around some before we look for a place to stay. And so we went around the outer belt of Boston and came to Route 3, and that went up into New Hampshire. And we drove up there, and I took some pictures in New Hampshire. And by coincidence, I really wasn't paying attention to UFOs then, but I found out it was kind of where he was, kind of like the tail end of where the Betty and Barney Hill thing had occurred. But we came back to Boston and looked around, and we couldn't find a motel or any place to stay. It seemed to be full. And so we were going to circle the outer belt again and look around there. And so we were leaving Boston, and south of us was this airport. This was a small airport. I think it was Norwood Memorial Airport. And we could see airplanes come in with their green lights and their red lights on the wings and their landing lights and everything. And we could see some of them landing and, airport, traffic. And everything looked normal except that lower. And we saw this as we were leaving Boston. There was this white light, very, very, very white. And it was blinking off and on. And it wasn't anything like an airplane light. And my sister kept saying she thought it was a UFO. And I kept telling her she, needed her head examined, that this was a helicopter. And I explained to her that if it was a UFO, that the police and everybody would be out, taking pictures and putting it on the news and everything. So it couldn't possibly be.
Of course not.
Huh?
Of course not.
Of course not. I'd never seen anything like it either, but, I was in science, so I explained this to her. And so we were going out Route 9, and we turned south on Route 95, which is the east. It was in the news recently because part of it collapsed, and it's a main north-south freeway along the coast. And I was going south, and there was a woods on one side, on the west side. And there was this ball. It looked like a glass ball that was transparent, and there was a light on the inside. And it was going through all different phases of the spectrum of like blue and red, like pink and purple and all different. It would be reddish and then it'd go bluish, and it just kept changing. And there was a thing on the outside that seemed to be going around in a circle, like a big C that went around circling. And I had no idea what that was. And then the inside of the car turned green. And I looked around, and I suspected that weird thing on the road, but it didn't. It was in the woods, but it wasn't green. And I couldn't see green anywhere except inside the car. And I was trying to figure that out. And then it disappeared, and we continued. And we were arguing about it, and I was telling her, but anyway, then I guess the reason she thought it was odd was she has real good eyesight and she's a bird watching and see it, feathers on a bird like a mile away and things. And I can see an ostrich if it's right in front of me. But anyway, she's better seeing than I am. But she said that she thought it would be one place and then be someplace else just instantly. And so that's why she thought it was a UFO, maybe. And so we were driving along, and she started screaming at me to pull over. And I sort of said, you're crazy. And she continued screaming, and so I pulled over. And I pointed my hand out the window and said, I was going to say, dingbat, that's a helicopter. And then I saw something looked like a meteor way, way off. And then this thing came over the trees. And it looked like a metallic thing that was real. I don't know if it was or not, but it had what looked like 7 windows. They were square, not airplane windows, and big. And it was filled up with light. And it was going through this pattern of like maybe the first 3 would blink twice, and then all 7, and then all 4, and then back into the same sequence. And it had one little red light on one end and one little green light on the other, and these didn't blink. And at that time, I realized she was right and I was wrong. Of course, I kind of realized that to start with, but I didn't say it. But anyway, I'd been taking pictures with just a regular camera, but I also had a Polaroid with high-speed film, 3000 ASA.
Oh boy.
In the car. And so I found the film and found my camera. And I was just going to take an unbelievable picture because I was in photography at the DIA and I knew what I could do with the time exposure and get this thing with the 7 windows up in the sky and maybe get the freeway and get stereo pictures. And, proof UFOs exist even for all I knew. I just thought this was the most wonderful picture I could ever take. And we'd seen lots of blimps with lighted sides, and this didn't look anything like that. And it was soundless, and it was just nothing like that. And it didn't have wings or anything. It was just like what they call a Tic Tac now. Yeah. And so anyway, I was standing there, and I finally got my camera ready. Well, she said right after, while I was pointing out the window, she said that it shined a blue light inside of the car. And I didn't know that until I read her thing. We didn't talk about it for years later because she went to Brazil as a missionary, and I'm married and moved to Nevada, and we didn't see each other for like 4 or 5 or 6 years later. So we didn't discuss it. And even when we did, we didn't discuss it much because I thought someday we're going to write this up and we don't want to influence each other. Yeah. But anyway, I found out that about the blue light in the car when I read her thing many years later. But anyway, I had written everything up right after it happened, and we didn't know we had anything from her. But she just last year found a letter she wrote to our mother the same day it happened. So we both had a write-up from right when it happened, which
fabulous.
And so that was a real good find. And anyway, then I was about to take the picture, and just this fabulous picture. And a truck driver drove over and parked in front of us and came over and stood right beside me and said, "What are you doing?" And I thought, oh, we have another witness, until he asked me, "What are you doing?" This big thing was there.
Get out of the way.
Yeah. And and I pointed at it, and I didn't say UFO or anything. And he turned around and rotated just around to the opposite direction, looked in the opposite direction, said, "I don't see anything," which I was missing this wonderful picture, and he was giving me the creeps, and I was scared of him. And so he turned around, and then he said the same thing. "What are you doing?" And I pointed again like an idiot, and he turned around, looked the opposite direction, said, "I don't see anything." Well, then I'd missed this picture, and my sister's write-up said that at the time, I just found this out recently, at the time, she said I took a real long time to load the camera, and she apparently didn't know I was talking to a man, even though she was standing right beside me. And I just found that out. I thought she knew I was talking to him, although I should have known earlier. But then she said that while I was talking to the man, that it just was one place and it was someplace else. And I didn't notice that. But when he walked back, well, the thing was a long ways away, and I was afraid I'd get lens flares from the freeway. And so there was a hill. And so I ran, and she tried to stop me. And I realized that I should have realized then that she didn't know anything about the man, because she tried to stop me. And I kept trying to explain to her that she had to protect the car from the man, but she didn't seem to know what I was talking about. But anyway, I ran up the hill and took pictures, and one of them turned out real well. I mean, as far as telling things, it was, but we didn't understand it at all at that time. When I came back and pulled it out of the Polaroid and looked at everything, and then the object went over to the airport and began circling.
Oh my!
And it was circles so that from north to south, it would blink twice and be off 3 times. Then from south to north, it was so fast you couldn't even see it. It just kept doing that. And at that time, I heard a sound like a jet, and I wondered if it could have been either a sonic boom or a jet taking off. Later, I found out there was no jets at the airport, but it just didn't sync with what the thing was doing, and I don't know why. But anyway, then we decided to, the thing had been going south, and for some reason I thought it was going to go north again. So I decided to go down the freeway and turn the car around and come back in case it went north. I don't know why I thought that, but anyway, so I pulled in the freeway, and this truck driver got right in behind me on my bumper and began chasing us. And I knew he was following or chasing us because if I switch lanes, he switched lanes. You know, I kept switch lanes to the right so he could go around. He just stayed right on my bumper. And the truck had high headlights that shined in my mirror, and I couldn't see anything. And I'd speed up and slow down and everything. He just stayed there.
Irena, was this when you were employed by the Defense Intelligence Agency?
Yes, it was when I was employed by the Defense Intelligence Agency with a very high security clearance, working on very secure documents that are still classified.
Yeah.
So anyway, I thought he was going to kill us, and I was terrified. And I thought, if I go on the left-hand lane and swerve off suddenly when I see an intersection, maybe he can't follow me. And that was real dangerous because somebody was going faster on the right-hand side. We'd have, smashed, or I'd have been in deep trouble or dead or something.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did, and I got rid of him so far as I could tell. I didn't have any idea what the truck looked like. So I turned around the intersection, came back, and the thing at first was circling, then it started northwest, and I was going north, and I passed the ball of light, and the inside of the car turned green again. And then we wound up, the roads went like north and south and east and west, so I had to keep zigzagging. And finally we wound up on this real miserable gravel road with potholes and houses far apart you couldn't see them, no place to turn around. It was just going a little bit faster than I could drive the car without tearing it up. And so finally I just gave up. We really wanted to see it, but I couldn't, keep up with it. And so we went back and drove all the way back to Drew, and I stayed with her. We called our parents and told them, and then we told her roommates, and they didn't believe us. And so I was supposed to pick up these 2 men, and they didn't show up. And I waited until late. And so finally I drove back to Washington, D.C., and then I had a poltergeist experience. And then, which I didn't even know what poltergeists were then. And then everything became pretty normal, and I wrote the whole thing up. And apparently my sister had written the whole thing up that day and sent it to my mother.
That's wonderful.
We didn't realize that she had that until last year.
Irena, at its closest, could you estimate about the size that this object was?
I could just, it was night, and I would just guess. My sister saw it better than I did because I was doing all these other things, and she was just looking at it. I would guess maybe 20 to 30 feet long, but that's just a rough guess.
Sure. Informed by all of this, you continue on in your course in the world of science. At what point did things veer off enough that you felt, I need to become involved in research and investigation more seriously in this subject of UFOs, UAPs, truly anomalous phenomena. When did those gears shift, so to say, in your life?
Well, I must say that I published the photograph in a scientific journal that I got from that. But anyway, it was a time exposure and it showed some interesting things. But anyway, later I was going about my normal life, just perfectly normal. You know, we had a family and I was working and everything. And for some reason, I just woke up one morning. I was terrified of UFOs. I mean, really scared. No reason at all. And I was scared to go outside. And I thought UFOs are sneaky things. And that, like, if I was off by myself, I might see one. And so I just stayed close to the house and everything. Yeah, our dog got lost and I was scared to go out in the woods and look for it and things. And so I decided that I'll report, you know, our old UFOs. And I contacted the Center for UFO Study, Dr. Heinrich's thing, and they sent me a form. And I was at Ohio State working during the daytime. And I thought I'll fill out that form right now. It was noon. And so for some reason, I went to the end of the building, down some stairs and up. I saw this really funny thing out the window. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And I saw somebody new and I asked her to look at it. And she couldn't figure out. And so we both went into the department office. And a bunch of people looked at it. And nobody could figure out what it was. We saw it over Ohio State University. It was kind of over the slope, the landing slope of the, it's called the John Glenn Airport now. And it looked like it had just gone over Battelle Memorial Institute, which is west of the university. And nobody could figure out what it was. And it was in sight for like, maybe 20 minutes. And later I had professors and all kinds of people write up things. And I told them, you know, this will be confidential and I won't tell anybody. But so I got reports from a number of people and it was heading northeast. And I checked the wind direction. The wind direction wasn't, you know, it was going against the wind. And so I got real good write-ups from 5 people describing it and describing all the circumstances and everything. Only that happened right that day when I started to do a report. And all this time I'd been scared of UFOs, that they appear, you know, when you're off by yourself. And this was in public. But I wasn't a UFO investigator then or anything.
Yeah.
And if I was, I would have figured out some way to put it in the newspaper and see if other people had seen anything. But at that time, I didn't know enough to do that. Right while it was inside, I called somebody at Battelle that I knew was interested in UFO. He was a scientist. And he went and climbed up the stairs to the top of the Battelle and couldn't see anything. And he also called the airport. And the airport said they didn't see anything had anything on radar, yeah. Which was strange because we were there at Ohio State and all of us saw it. And I had, you know, written descriptions from several people, including professors.
At this point, I'm going to introduce the specific subject that we're here to talk about. I do think it's fascinating, wonderful, you know, just one of those great coincidences that happens in life, but also very poignant that the first case, and I always catch myself on that word because it's so dispassionate. We're talking about a shorthand phrase for, in many cases, the most shocking, life-changing, paradigm-shifting moments in a human being's life, but that your first case became what we're talking about right now. And I think October 10th, 1973, let's see.
October
11th, yeah. The first book to be written on the subject, which your co-author, Philip Mantle, whose Flying Disc Press has published many UFO books, has republished this book, but UFO Contact at Pascagoula by my friend Charles Hickson and William Mendez, a good UFO researcher. I'm just going to read the first part of the liner notes here. On the night of October 11th, 1973, two very frightened Mississippians, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, presented themselves at the Jackson County Sheriff's Department and related a tale almost too incredible to tell. As a matter of fact, their first impulse had been to tell no one, for fear that they would be thought crazy. But it also occurred to them that if they had not just suffered, what they might produce they were afraid of a full-scale invasion at that moment in their lives. I first met Charlie, I think, in the mid-1980s, more than 10 years after the event, when he came to New York to undergo hypnotic regression with Bud Hopkins, whose assistant I was, and we became friends. Bud traveled to Pascagoula in 1988 and took part in a conference there that Charlie had organized. And the next year, he invited me to go to Pascagoula. Also, Deb White-Cabell, a dear friend and the subject of then Bud Hopkins' best-known and certainly best-selling book, Intruders. And we walked the walk. There was no question in my mind of the sincerity and the reality involved. And one of Charlie's major concerns was Calvin. Calvin Parker, who you know well and are more familiar with events surrounding his life than probably some of his relatives, was a generation younger than Charlie. They were friends, but it was really one of Charlie's sons that Calvin was friends with when they went on their fishing trip. And it was difficult for Charlie, and he knew it was that much more difficult for Calvin, who alternately had the courage to speak on it and then go into really some dark denials about it. And after Charlie passed, Calvin continued to struggle with it. Special thanks and special recognition for our British colleague, Philip Mantle, who has been absolutely dogged in his pursuit of so many important UFO accounts and getting them published. Probably none more than this. And in, I think, 2018, with Philip's encouragement and assistance, we saw this come out. Calvin's terrific book, which, like yours, covers the territory, but obviously from a very personal point of view. I finally was able to meet and become friends with Calvin. And for me, in a library filled with books and a lot of books filled with inscriptions, two of the ones that are most important to me is this one from Calvin to Peter Robbins, my friend. No, I'm sorry, that's Peter Robbins, thank you. The one from Charlie, inscribed when we met. So for me, this story is personal as well. And what's just been published, I think 4 days ago as we speak, is this behemoth. And again, this is not an illusion. This is a big book. It could kill a small animal if dropped from a few feet, which we will not do as any kind of demonstration. That would be cruel. It is
also fly with it.
It is a breathtakingly complete book, and it is not just filled with a detailed account, backing up and confirming so much of what Calvin and Charlie had published in the years earlier, but it's filled with photographs and documents and maps and every kind of visual aid imaginable to give one a full sense of the sweep of this extraordinary story. And we are going to have to go into a break now, a little bit late. This is Peter Robbins, my special guest, Dr. Irena Scott, and we will be back in 4 minutes or so.
It's almost here, ladies and gentlemen. The UNX Network Year 2 anniversary at XCon 2023. XCon is being held this year from October the 30th to November 1st at the beautiful Oasis Hotel and Conference Center in Springfield, Missouri. Top speakers include host of America Unearthed, Scott Walter, plus Haley Ramsey, Sev Tak, UNX's very own Maureen Richmond and Dan Terry, Mindy Toutfest, Harriet McFeely, Forrest Crawford, and many more. And they're all coming to deliver new information on topics like UFOs, alien encounters, cryptids and ancient secrets, and real hauntings from the afterlife. Join us for the film premiere of A Haunting in Blue Hill. And don't miss the Mad Hatter Paranormal Halloween Bash, Banquet, and Costume Contest on All Hallows Eve, October 31st. So join us as we close out the 2023 conference season. Info and tickets are available now at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com, and we'll see you there.
And we are back. Peter Robbins here. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. And my special guest is Dr. Irena Scott. And here you are. Irena, when did you first hear from Philip Mantle about a request to get involved in this case? Or how did you come to co-author this book with Phil?
Well, I sort of got more open about UFOs after what I told you about, but I wasn't really doing anything. But I did join a UFO group, and then a number of years, many years later, I saw an ad someplace that somebody was looking for submissions for their publish, and I kind of had a book written, but I hadn't done anything with it. And so I submitted it to Philip Mantle, and he accepted. So anyway, I had published, and I was very happy with it because I got my book published on UFOs. And then he connected with Calvin, and there were a lot of other sightings besides him. I mean, this was very unusual for abduction because there'd been a lot of other people that'd seen UFOs. I mean, the abduction was kind of like it was out in public. And so he was in England with this English accent, and they were this Southern accent, and I was sort of in between. And he asked me to interview people. And so I was happy to do it because I was really interested. And so I started interviewing people. And then I published the book about Pascagoula 2 and the other witnesses and some other things that happened at the same time, including that sound. But it was really weird because I started out on that sound. I paid no attention to the abduction. I mean, that was just, and then I wound up working on the same thing I started on, years ago, just by coincidence.
Let's lay out the story. I think many people in our audience, being that this is usually a show devoted to UFOs and the paranormal, have some familiarity with the incident in Pascagoula. But with the aid of our esteemed producer, Race Hobbs, let's get some images up and tell us the basic story here that you then, along with Philip, spent so much time and energy researching. Race, can we bring up that first image? And there it is, the great cover of this book. Before the show, I was chatting with Race and saying that in all the years I worked with Bud Hopkins, the great majority of the accounts that he got from experiencers and abductees, nobody, I don't think, has ever kept hard statistics on this, but let's say 75, 80%, some variation of an archetypical, what's become known in the genre as a gray, and the other 20% or so varying wildly. I think the being that we're looking at here comes under, and no uncertain terms, the varying wildly category. We have never really had a description of another being quite like this, which I know is a way that certainly folks who have any understandable anxiety at the subject, and even colleagues, say, too far-fetched, this one's beyond me, let's go on to the next. But we can't dismiss this that easy. Next image. So one of the most poignant photographs of these two guys, geez. And not long after the event, boy, that picture. Next.
They were in shock.
Oh, gosh, how could they not be? In fact, go back again, Race. Some photos really just do capture moments. This is very shortly after the event in late 73. Anybody that's familiar with what Travis Walton and the young men with him went through after his return, and just dealing with a wall of disbelief, sarcasm, dismissiveness, and a media so rabid that they literally would have chewed through the walls of the house if they could. You're not just dealing with the profound shock of something beyond possibility. You're dealing with a world of folks who are really curious and who want a piece of you. And I can only imagine how incredibly draining it is. Next. All yours, Irena.
Well, that's the pier where it actually happened.
Yep.
They just went fishing, and the account they gave of the whatever the things were, it wasn't like they had looked it up or found out other people see grays or anything. So theirs was totally different, but it shows that they hadn't rehearsed or done a hoax or anything. They didn't know anything about anything. They just described what they saw. Yeah. Well, that was the pier they were fishing from.
I visited that pier with Charlie Hickson in 1989. And while we were standing there, he basically related the story of what happened in his perception. Can you relate the story as you know it?
Well, they were fishing, and Calvin was a little nervous because he had a new car, and they had to walk through this trashy, debris-ridden, weedy place to get to the pier. And there was no trespassing sign. He was afraid he might get in trouble with his car. And so anyway, Charles wanted to go on out and fish. And so they went out and they were fishing. And then they saw a blue light. And Calvin was afraid. They were both afraid it was the police. And Calvin told Charles that he can be the one that goes to jail because it was his idea to fish there. And Calvin didn't want to get in any trouble. But then this thing came up, sort of levitating. It wasn't on the ground. It didn't make a sound. And it was sort of roughly football shaped. And I guess they thought it was about maybe 30 feet long, but they weren't sure. And they didn't know what it was. And there was this real bright light. And then it kind of lit up, and it opened up apparently, or the door slid open or something, and all this really bright light came out that was just really bright. And these three things came out. They thought they were mechanical. They were levitating. They didn't walk. Two of them grabbed Charlie and one grabbed Calvin. And they both just paralyzed right then, when they were grabbed, or maybe even before.
Yeah.
And couldn't move. All they could move was their eyes, which was a strange type of anesthesia. They thought, they'd been injected or something. And these things took them inside the object and separated them. They were in different chambers, and they couldn't see anything. It was just really, really bright light. And both of them, I'll just say this in general, described sort of being scanned. I think Charlie said that something came out of the wall that looked like an eye, and it kind of focused on him, and then it scanned him. I mean, it gave that impression that it was scanning him. And the same for Calvin. And he said it was shaped like sort of like a deck of cards. I think today you'd say it was shaped like an iPhone or tricorder or something like that from Star Trek. But anyway, they had the impression of being scanned, and then they were returned. But when it happened, they were captive, and they didn't even believe in UFOs. They didn't know anything about UFOs. And these things were really strange, and they were captured. They couldn't move or anything. And then they returned them to the pier. And then the thing had sort of made like a zipping sound and left.
Irena, let me cut you off for one moment just to ask you to remind us about what time did this whole incident commence?
They didn't have watches, and it was after dark.
Yeah.
They thought maybe 8 or 9 or something. They didn't know.
Thanks. Continue on.
That's just estimate. Then, if that happened to you, well, not only have you been through, and they were really, really stressed, and they just remembered like being on there and being scanned, but it's like they had really bad fear. And so anyway, at first Calvin just standing there with his arms up in the air and didn't move, and then he fell down. And Charlie, he was a vet that had been through life and death situations. He was terrified too, and they both fell down and managed to get up and everything. Yeah. And then they said, well, we'll never tell anybody about this because nobody would believe us. And so then they managed to get back to the car, and the car was damaged, and nobody's ever explained why. One of the windows was shattered, and then when they opened it, it broke and fell out, and the car wouldn't start. It was a brand new car, and nobody ever has explained what happened there. But then Charlie, who was older and had been through Vietnam, life and death situations and things,
You bet. You bet.
He thought this should be reported. Calvin didn't want anything to do with it.
Of course.
And so what would you do in that situation? Nobody'd believe you, and you'd just been through, like the worst thing you could imagine. So anyway, I think, first of all, he stopped at a newspaper, and the newspaper was closed. And then they tried to call Kessler Air Force Base to report to the Air Force. And it was late at night then. And the Air Force said, well, we don't do any of that. You know, UFOs don't exist. Project Blue Book is closed. They didn't even heard of Project Blue Book. Yeah. And so they told him to contact the sheriff, which Calvin didn't want to do. But Charlie thought they should contact somebody. So he called the sheriff, and eventually they went to that night, after all this had happened to him, they went to the sheriff's office. Well, the sheriff did an excellent job of investigating, because first of all, they separated them and took and interviewed him. Then they put them together and interviewed him. And then the sheriff's office wanted to find out if they were hoaxing. And so what they did was put them in a room together, interviewing, but they had a secret hidden tape recorder. And so the interviewer left, and then they figured, you know, that if they were hoaxing, they'd be laughing at taking in the police and everything. Well, when they took the tape recorder out and heard it, they realized the men were in shock and just terrified. And Calvin was praying, and they thought they had died and everything else. And so they believed him. And then they let him go home, and they went to work the next day, just expecting a normal day of work. Well, they began to get all these phone calls from every place you can imagine, and it was disrupting their work. And the owner of the company came down and joined them, and somehow the information had gotten out. And it was like they thought each other did it, or the sheriffs. But I think what happened when I talked to the police is that the police had put out a bulletin about it, of course, that night. And I think that's how the press and everything else found out about it.
Wow. You're familiar with the Travis Walton case, of course. And you have some idea of the unwanted attention this brought to Travis when he was a young man, 22 years old, and the impact that can have on your private life, your personal life, your professional life, your peace of mind. How did this impact on Calvin at the time? And am I correct in remembering he was like in his late teens still, or early 20s?
There were different things in the ledger. I think it said 18. Yeah. He was really young, and he didn't want to talk about it. And he didn't want to go through his whole life, you know, with everybody pointing to his head and saying, that's a crazy guy. Yeah. And so he didn't want to talk about it, but he was on the tape. So for sure it happened to him, but he didn't talk about it for around 50 years. And then he was losing his health, and he discovered that people were actually interested and not making fun of him and concerned about him. That's right. And his wife wanted him to say something. Philip Mantle wanted him to say something. And finally, he wrote 2 books about it.
Yeah. Yeah, he did. What does the new book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, add to the dialogue that we don't find in Charlie's book or Calvin's book, or really any of what's on the public record? Can you give us some idea of some of what makes this newest book unique in its own way?
Well, all the rest of these things one thing unique is, among many things, is that they reported immediately. Yeah. And in a lot of cases, most cases, nobody reports it for years. And a lot of people don't even remember it and go through hypnosis and all that. Well, they remembered it consciously, reported immediately, and were interrogated by authorities immediately, and went to Kessler Air Force Base and was also interrogated by like colonels and things like that, and then by 2 PhDs, Dr. Hynek and Dr. Harder. Yes. immediately afterwards, and they had a conscious recall of the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose they did. Maybe there were things that happened to them that, could have been
affected by screen memory or what have you.
Or maybe they were told not to remember or something. But they had recall of, major things like the beings and everything. And that was unusual. The beings were totally unusual because most of the pictures of beings are slender things that don't have a spacesuit on and have big eyes and all that. Well, these were porky type things with wrinkly skin and kind of fattish. And
Race, can I ask you to bring up the cover of the book again? Yeah. I'm
sorry.
Continue.
No.
For me, I remember when the case broke as just a blip in my world because I was not consciously involved or interested or really had anything to do with the subject at that time. But it made probably every newspaper in America and quite a number across Europe because it was such a sensational story. And, in one sense, the tabloids like the National Enquirer had a field day, but we're stuck with credible accounts of an incredible event by two decent, believable men who not only have no reason to deceive on this event, but I'm sure wished in their hearts that it had never happened. The being that we're looking at here, one of the reasons that I learned that the case was problematic for, people in the field to a degree, and certainly the general public was, look at this ridiculous apparition. If there are space creatures or beings or other intelligences from other dimensions, surely they don't look like this. This is some strange, wild cartoon or hallucination from someone's mind. Anyway, even for those people that take this stuff seriously, nobody's ever seen anything like this before or since. So let's just chalk it off to their imagination or something else. It just can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it is something else. To what degree do you think that this particular being played into the picture of the way the subject was, reported by the media or taken into account by the UFO research community?
Well, this was different. And to me, it sort of showed that they didn't make it up or, because if you're going to make up a hoax, you'd look up what the aliens look like and all that. Well,
let's create a new one. Yes, that doesn't watch well in hoaxes.
Yeah, I mean, it was like they were really reporting it because why would they, if they were hoaxing, why would they, report something totally weird? And it was like these things were just a general mold of a human, like they had, like claw-like or thumbs and things and arms and kind of like legs. And like on your head, you have protrusions like ears and nose, and that was just this general thing. It's like somebody just made a very rough humanoid figure and said, let's put these robots out and full of stupid humans or something. But, they thought they were mechanical.
Yes. Yes, continue.
No, that's all.
Okay. Race, can you bring up the next picture?
There were a lot of other sightings. On the same night, there were a number of people calling the police saying, I saw something. And that's, with the abductions, like there's not anything like, that's why we say beyond reasonable doubt, is because there were a lot of other sightings that same night and around the same time. And also, when my mother called me, that was a really weird thing for her to do. I mean, she was in Ohio, and this happened in Pascagoula, but there was a big flap in Ohio going on too. And so it's like something was affecting everybody. And this was like the biggest wave of UFO sightings ever, is what some people have said.
Yeah.
And it went across the country. But there were a lot of other sightings right down there in Pascagoula, and some of them very close to where this took place.
Do you think, with the understanding that in terms of the media, there's, and I'm generalizing in the most sweeping terms here, kind of a mindset that there's this sort of egghead, intellectual, Northeast, liberal establishment view of things, and a much more traditional, more conservative, old-fashioned, if you will, take on things that helps to shape the way we perceive things depending on the region of the country we grow up in or the way we were brought up. In other words, was there anything particularly about local coverage from Mississippi and surrounding states that generally was much different than the way it was reported around the world? Do you feel that there was more belief invested in these two guys within their region, or that it was doubly rejected because you're an embarrassment to us Southerners? You know, I don't know how else to say it.
Well, I talked to a policeman who heard the report, and he said the police report went out and said, well, they picked up two drunks who said they saw a UFO, and, you know, it was sarcastic and all that. That's what he heard on the police report that night. And, you know, like if it happened to the president of the United States, there'd be a certain decor of being polite. But with somebody down there, they're, you know, I mean, these were nice, honest people and everything.
Yes.
But there was kind of a stigma. But I mean, what I could understand was why they always say, if you see a UFO, somebody says, well, you're drunk. Well, if lots of people get drunk, but they don't see UFOs, why would you see UFOs if you're drunk anyway? And they hadn't had anything to drink, apparently, although the one took some alcohol later.
Yes.
But yeah, I think there was some stigma. And of course, if you're a shipyard worker, I imagine you really get harassed.
Yeah. In fact, Charlie at the time had a company, and I've got his old business card right here. He renamed it UFO Salvage. And what they dealt in was auto, industrial, marine, fabrication, repair, and welding.
Okay.
And again, this is a salt of the earth guy. Certainly nobody would make up a claim like that to get more building business in the salvage field, people rushing to your door. It's just so counterintuitive. You know, here we are, though, now, all these years later, and certainly for really almost half a dozen years now, thereabouts, the climate changed. We are in what I would call, not that we're completely free of it, a post-ridicule era. Certainly, Calvin and Charlie and you, when you've had your experiences with your sister, when I had my sighting with my sister's kids, that we kind of got it hardwired into ourselves that saying you've seen something like this is a way of saying, I may be delusional, I'm looking for attention, I'm a con man, I'm a mystic, I want to be famous. when in reality, you're just doing your best to say what, you perceived. Right now, we are in, I wouldn't say a golden age, and things may still move very slowly, but things have changed. Um, in getting this book out right now, of course, people like you and me, who this is an important subject in our lives, and we read and we love books and we have libraries. This is a book we want to add to our library. How do you think its chances are of kind of breaking through into a wider audience now, knowing that they can buy a UFO book in public and read it without feeling they're drawing mocking attention to themselves? Um, how do you think this book will go down with the general reading public? And is there a way that any of us can help to get word out about this into the wider world of folks who are not necessarily that interested in UFOs and their implications?
Well, there was the 2017 New York Times article, which took it seriously and brought it to attention that this is something serious.
Yeah.
There's been NASA and congressional hearings, such as one recently, that actually took it seriously. And the TV has always before, if you said UFOs, well, they'd play the stupid music. Make all dumb comments and things. Da, 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 da. And they're not doing that as much now. And they don't have an authority come on and say UFOs can't possibly exist. Anybody that sees them is, off their rocker or anything. So it's changing slightly. And with this book, there were a number of elements that were quite different because most of the time they're just talking about UFOs as what they call it, anomalous, unidentified anomalous phenomena, which I think is better than UFOs because they're not necessarily flying around. And but this is about an abduction, which isn't something they're discussing as yet. That there were a lot of witnesses that saw something at the same time. In fact, there are even 2 witnesses that might have watched the abduction and also had an experience themselves right at the same time. And there were people on the river that appeared to see the same thing.
Yes.
And a number of people seem to be witnesses for that, which hasn't happened, I don't think, with hardly anything else. And especially not with the people actually remembering consciously what happened.
There is something even now in, again, what I'll call the post-ridicule, although it's not absolutely true, it's certainly much more than it was, era of the last half dozen or so years, that there is still a reticence, still a lagging of people enthusiastically wanting to associate their name with the subject. And in the most, I think, complex, meaningful, challenging, in some ways intimidating area of study in the entire world of ufology or UFO scholarship and studies, it is this so-called abduction phenomena, where human beings are taken and examined, put through whatever they are put through, and then returned with fully conscious memories, partially conscious memories, screen memories, or no memory at all. I try to keep my eyes on the reality that although I have been dealing with this subject starting with the understanding that this had happened to one of my sisters when we were children, and beginning to try to wrap my head around this more than 40 years ago, that I still find it absolutely not hard to believe, but so difficult to fully appreciate. One can study something your whole life, and at the same time, unless it's happened to you, or you've had a firsthand experience of what it is that is your area of scholarship, it's it's as different as night and day. And I sometimes wonder if I woke up in the middle of the night with a glow in the room and small beings standing at the foot of my bed and hearing particular phrases inside my head, and then feeling myself in violation of every law of gravity that I have ever lived for every second of my life, simply lifting off my bed and about to be transported through an extremely real corporeal surface, that I would not say to myself, yes, so I'm finally having this experience. Isn't this interesting? I think I would freak the hell out. I don't think I would do very well, even if I know that people are returned. And I think one of the most dramatic parts of the hearings 2 weeks ago, 4 or 5 weeks ago now, was hearing David Gersh, other whistleblowers talk about things like the biological entities, the other phrase they use, biologics, that somebody on live television in a committee meeting and questioning in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., is talking about crashes, retrievals, back engineering, even if they managed to drag their feet for years. This was incredibly historic. And what were your impressions watching or listening to some of these hearings against the backdrop of your own life, and thinking about not just your book with Phil on this particular case, but how this would have resonated for people like Charlie Hickson, no longer with us, and ever so many, Betty and Barney Hill, ever so many people with the courage to come forward at a time when the best you could hope for was simply not overtly being made fun of. It's something I don't even know if they would have imagined happening. I certainly didn't imagine it happening until not that long ago. Your thoughts, Irena?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've talked about several people we knew had just given up and said, well, the government will never say anything about it. And then the people died. And so they keep on, we're lucky we kept on living and we're, experiencing this. But
well said. Yes, we are lucky in that respect. Or we would not be here talking to each other in actual terms, perhaps at a seance table. Race, do we have another image or two there? I believe we have, but I may be. Okay, let's talk about this document. Official Cresserfield UFO investigation of Hickson and Parker. What are we looking at here?
This is where they were interrogated at Kessler Air Force Base. And they had some big people there, like colonels and things like that talked to them. And then the two doctors, Hynek and Harder, also talked to them. And people believed them. They, were perfectly normal people with, not crazy or anything on any other way, except, that people didn't accept UFOs in. Yeah. And that just proof that they were interrogated by quite a few people at the Air Force Base. They were afraid they were contaminated, and Kelvin bagged his clothes and tossed them and took a shower with bleach, I think.
Oh my
He was
God.
so worried about contamination.
Yeah.
And they took him to the Singing River Hospital, which couldn't investigate for radiation or anything. And so they took him to Kessler and interrogated him and checked him over for any type of contamination too.
Yeah.
But that's another thing to show they're sincere, is they were worried about contamination. Very worried.
This was something that the government first discussed in a memorandum, as I recall, from the 1970s, which presupposed certain legalities and illegalities. If you had been, you claimed to have been aboard a craft or been in contact with another intelligence, that you potentially could be treated as somebody to be quarantined at the discretion of the government, and that there were certain laws that would govern how you could interact with other people until the government gave you clearance, so to say. The fact that Calvin did his best, again, he gave some early talks, but ultimately went into a prolonged state of denial, at least public denial, and hurt himself in the process of doing whatever was necessary to subdue these memories, to dull his feelings. I can only imagine the toll that would take on us when you're living with a profound truth that if it weren't for fear of ridicule or ridicule of your family, that of course you want to get out. Nobody wants to live with a feeling like that internalized. What do you think it was, or what do you know it was, that was it really just a call from Philip Mantle saying, time to tell your story? Or do you think there was something more than that, or that he was just ready to turn the page and go into this new chapter of his life?
Well, after it happened, he lost his job. It wasn't his fault. It was because there was so much media bothering them. And he didn't want to have anything to do with it. And he had a nervous breakdown and went to the hospital some time later. And then he got jobs and everything. And his wife, he was engaged at that time.
Yeah.
And his wife was happy to marry him. I guess they were kind of worried that maybe she wouldn't and things, but
Sure.
she did. But then he kept quiet for many, many years. But they went to a funeral, and he had always disguised his name. And this time he wrote his name down, and people knew who he was. And people came up and were friendly and inquired, "How are you? What happened?" And they were concerned about him. And this was a brand new experience for him, because he thought everybody was going to be, telling him he's crazy and looking at that batty person there and all that. And that gave him a little bit of confidence. And then his wife wanted him to say something about it. And she said, it's time to come out and say something. And it's safe, that people are concerned about you. And then so did Philip Mantle. I mean, it wasn't just Philip Mantle, it was the people around him that were saying, it's okay, we're concerned about you. And so he finally did, and he's glad he did now, and so his wife.
Yeah, that's obvious in the presentations he does. I had, of course, seen, him in video, read all the books, knew Charlie, had Bud Hopkins take on the event. But it wasn't until, I guess less than a year before the pandemic hit, hearing him speak in Nevada, where, by the end of the third sentence, it was, this guy is without guile. There's no affect. There's no desire to please. He is not concerned with you liking him or not liking him. Extremely polite, well-mannered, and a true American archetype. We all are in our own ways, but he had that audience in the palm of his hand for that rare reason that there was nothing going on except a sincere desire to communicate as best he could why the hell he was up there in so many words, and the warmth that audience responded with. And I'm quite sure audiences all over that have heard him speak have had that same feeling. I don't know, it really set him apart in some ways. And at the same time, making it clear that, there's a horrible cliche that would be funny if it wasn't so insulting to so many people who have worked so hard to get us closer to the truth, whether as experiencers, abductees, authors, researchers, or investigators, that you're in it for the money. I mean, again, if it wasn't so hilarious with the rarest of exceptions, it really is insulting. And Calvin was very clear to say, my family and I can use some, extra income. And I'm proud that this book, in so many words, will help us achieve that. It was really a breath of fresh air. That's the way it is sometimes in life. You've heard him speak before an audience as well as sat down with him one-to-one, Irena?
No, I've just heard him and read.
Yeah.
I interviewed his wife in detail.
A lovely woman who, again, ferociously protective and supportive, especially as he struggled with more fragile health the last years. If you were going to, how can I say, encourage a friend to learn a little bit more about the subject of UFOs in general at this extraordinary time when major publications and broadcasters are regularly discussing the subject overall seriously, do you think most folks that would take to this story? It's about two regular guys, which is not a bad place to start for most people.
Well, for one thing, they say hoaxers want attention, and the one reason for hoaxing is to get attention. Well, he could have had worldwide attention right then at the start, and he, didn't want it.
Yeah.
And it took him almost 50 years before he said anything about it, even though there was proof that something happened right then. And so that's a reason to think, another reason that for sincerity.
Rach, do we have any more images in that package? I think we have one or two. Here we are. Okay, let's talk about this because this is a very special part of the story.
That's Pascagoula made the national news twice within a month, and the second time was because there was an underwater unidentified submerged object, USO.
Yes.
And it was seen November the 6th, which wasn't too long after their event, and close to the same place, very close. It had 16 witnesses, including 2 Coast Guard officers. And it was unidentified. These two, there's only one person alive that was a witness, and I interviewed him. He and his father were out, and they saw this thing floating around that was lit up under the water. And they tried to figure out what it was and hit it, and it sounded metallic. It was lit up and it just seemed to know its way around. And so then a bunch of other boaters also saw it. And he and his father went to get Coast Guard officers to come out and look at it. The Coast Guard officers came out and looked at it, and they had no idea what it was either. And they did the Coast Guard officer said it was strange because he said when you held your oar over it, that the oar didn't make a shadow that was like X-rays, and the light went right through. And so, they had the authorities come, and they couldn't figure out what it was either. It would, disappear and then appear someplace else.
Yeah.
And both of them, everybody seemed to think it knew its way around because there was a deeper trench in the Pascagoula River. And after a while, it seemed to go the deeper trench and leave. But nobody had any idea what it was. But the Coast Guard and the Navy took this very seriously and investigated with some top people and interviewed people and everything else. And it was funny, the contrast, because they took that seriously, investigated and everything else. With the abduction, it was not taken seriously back then. And so two things happened at the same time in almost the same place. I mean, almost the same time, just a few weeks difference. One was investigated seriously and scientifically, and the other one wasn't. But there was a lot of other things going on then. Like there was the Yom Kippur War. There was a DEFCON nuclear alert. It was maybe only the second one ever that took place that October for a nuclear war. The only other one was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And Nixon was the president of the United States. He was in a scandal, and his vice president was replaced, and he resigned, and he was kind of going around, he had his nuclear trigger, and he was sort of off, and everything else was going on. And they still investigated that seriously, in spite of everything else. So it was sort of a contrast that the Pascagoula abduction wasn't taken seriously, even though it happened at the same time as the other thing, and was seriously investigated. So there was serious reason to investigate that. Plus, in that area, there was a nuclear facilities too for shipbuilding, which the government was trying to keep secret. And, they say that there's more UFO sightings around nuclear facilities. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they say.
I believe it is too, and that's corroborated. An aside, this is before my time in the field, but folks who were senior to me shared this. As the Watergate hearings started to gain traction, and more American citizens were aware that this trial might actually result in an American president being convicted of a crime. I think in one of his more gracious, or maybe that's not the right word, responsible moments, Richard Nixon decided that the better course to take, rather than inflicting this extraordinary ordeal on the United States, was simply to resign, which he did. President Ford pardoned him. I think a terrible error, because it set a precedent that presidents seem to be above the law. And obviously, we'll be hearing more about that in the months to follow. My thought was, though, that a number of the smarter people in the field felt very strongly, or had gotten wind of the possibility, that before President Nixon capitulated, in so many words, and left office, that he was actually considering taking the lid off the UFO subject and actually addressing the country on the reality of visits from technology of advanced configuration piloted by beings of unknown origin. And if so, hoping in the process that dumping this into the public mindset at such a charged moment, a lot of Americans would say or think to themselves, including elected officials, this is without precedent. We have no idea what's going to happen. We should probably keep the president we have and try to weather this crisis together. Again, pure speculation, but this would not have been that much outside of the time of Charlie's and Calvin's experience. Right now, you've finished this book. You're, at home on the farm. Are you working on a new project that you can share anything about with us?
Yeah, I am. I'm just sort of analyzing what people think aliens look like and saying that they don't exactly match what we think they should look like. And I've written a book on that. I mean, if we were astronauts, we'd be wearing astronaut costumes and going to other planets. That's not what the aliens look like at all. I mean, we don't know what they look like, but that's what the image is. And so I think the whole subject's way more complicated than aliens flying ships, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's it. The best any of us can do is study, informed speculation, critical thinking, common sense, and the accounts of credible people, of incredible events. It's something I was talking with Race before we started the show, in perceiving the Pascagoula being so unique and so different than anything that's been reported since or after, is it's commonly understood that people that perceive entities, that have experiences like this, can come away from them with full or partial memories. Also, that they, and I take this very seriously, have the ability to mess with our memories, to create false memories, or as is better known in this context, screen memories. Knowing or deducing that the individual in question really can't handle seeing what I really look like. Therefore, I will do something to affect their memory of this so that they will actually see something equally incredible but less intimidating, a 4-foot-high white owl sitting on, their windowsill, rather than a gray alien or a thing like this. At the same time, I'm one of those people who subscribe to the very real possibility that there are instances that have nothing to do with their clouding that image or recreating it with a screen memory of something else. And that has to do with our own mind's ability to react in shock situations and do its best to protect us. Traumatic memories are in many cases not recalled because we can't deal with them. They can be recalled under certain circumstances or with the passage of time, and that it's our minds in some cases that may well be putting forward an image that we can tolerate, handle, accept, or otherwise live with to some degree, rather than whatever the hell it was that we actually saw that completely freaked us out. How do you feel about those kind of conflicting theories there?
Well, I guess my own experience when I was a kid, we saw this little tiny thing. We had no idea about UFOs or anything. It
Sure.
wasn't scary. We just watched it. We both woke up at the same time for unknown reasons. There was no way the thing could have got in the room.
Hmm.
And then we both became terrified at the same time. And all there was this little thing that we saw. Well, it seemed to me like there was some mind control going on because we both woke up at the same time. We both
Yeah.
became terrified at the same time. And this was terror like you wouldn't believe. I mean, I've had life and death situations. This was much worse than that. I mean, it was just unearthly terror. And so I think there's mind control going on.
Yeah.
And I mean, this little thing buzzing around the room wasn't sliced bit scary, but we were just, I mean, I was just so terrified you couldn't believe it.
In a way, frightened out of proportion based
Wow.
on
Yeah.
this little thing. At the same time, you were a 6-year-old girl. You were the senior person in the room. Your 4-year-old sister was there, although you weren't each aware of the others, being aware. That's an awful lot of weight when you're confronted with the truly unknown and know that nothing in your short life has even remotely prepared you for the possibility of what you're encountering in the moment. That is difficult.
Well, she seemed to be more aware than I was because she seemed to know that I was awake. I didn't know she was awake.
Hmm.
And so I think she woke up first, but we both woke up about the same time. But, there was some reason why we both woke up at the same time. Something had happened probably. And there was probably, more that went on, maybe.
The missing time, that phrase, which is now part of the lexicon, and which folks associate with paranormal and UFO related events rather than I'm missing time. We've just been caught up in a small maelstrom of it. We have a little less than 2 minutes until we end our show. Any closing thoughts to share with our audience, Irena?
I guess I think the Earth is only 4 billion years old, according to the latest thing, and the universe is like 13 billion years old, and we're just acting like UFOs are like spaceships with pilots, like humans do. And it may be something just completely beyond anything we can think of.
Yes.
But I think it also has to do with mind control, too, which is probably more dangerous than physical spaceships.
Yeah, that may well be the case. Anyway, I guess one of the things that we all need to do is keep as open a mind as possible, but not so open that your brain falls out. On that allegorical note, dear Irena Scott, thank you so much for joining us for this show. I hope our actual physical paths cross in the not too distant future, but wishing you a great September. And again, thanks for bringing Calvin Parker's story to right back where it belongs. This is Peter Robbins. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. My special guest tonight has been Dr. Irena Scott. Stay well, stand up for what you believe in, and be kind to each other. We'll see you next week.